So Doug Laycock gave one reason why there should not be government religious speech, and that's basically that it is clearly endorsing religion, and any claim to the contrary is a sham argument. And I completely agree with that. But I'm going to give another reason for a rule against government religious speech, and that's its effect on a religious minority. So in the past few years, non-believers have become much more prominent in the United States. Atheist books and atheist iPhone apps have made bestseller lists. Organizations for non-believers have grown by leaps and bounds. And President Obama even acknowledged non-believers in his inaugural address. At the same time, non-believers still make up a small minority in the United States, and they remain disliked, distrusted, and not truly American in the eyes of many. Indeed, atheists are regularly stereotyped as immoral and unpatriotic. And I argue that government religious speech, such as In God We Trust or Latin Cross War Memorial, violates the Establishment Clause in part because it exacerbates the precarious positions of non-believers in this country. One of the main goals of the Establishment Clause is to protect religious minorities, including non-believers. Government religious speech, however, undermines both the equality and liberty of non-believers. And so this presentation has 4 parts. First, I'm going to provide some background on the long-standing discrimination and prejudice that atheists have faced and continue to face in the United States. Next, I explain how government religious speech undermines the equality of non-believers in 2 ways. 1, by sending a message of unequal worth, and 2, by perpetuating negative stereotypes that lead to discrimination. Then I argue that government religious speech also harms the religious liberty of non-believers in 2 ways, by either coercing non-believers to participate in religious exercises, or at the very least, by contributing to the widespread prejudice that keeps non-believers in the closet. And I conclude by arguing that government has no strong interest in continuing this type of religious speech, and that claims about hostility to religion, if it's eliminated, are actually misplaced. So historically, atheists in the United States could not hold public office, testify in court, or serve on a jury. And this official discrimination persisted well into the 20th century. So, for example, the Supreme Court of Georgia held in 1963 that while it was not necessary for a witness to believe in a supreme being, it sure was desirable, and that a lack of faith is a matter to be considered in passing on credibility. Meanwhile, in 1992, South Carolina was still trying to enforce its constitutional provision banning atheists from public office. And today, a parent's non-belief can work against them in custody decisions, as courts regularly give custody to the believing parent over the non-believing parent. Right? In 21st century America, Americans do not like and do not trust atheists. And polls show that Americans view atheists more unfavorably than any other minority, and that includes regularly discriminating against minorities like Muslims and gays and lesbians. Right? Atheists may no longer be officially barred for office, but good luck to them getting elected, right? Because over 50% of people said they would not vote for an atheist, even if otherwise qualified, even if nominated by their own party. And Americans are equally unwilling to have their children marry atheists, and that question is considered a way to measure prejudice. And as I said, many Americans think atheists are 1, immoral, and 2, unpatriotic and un-American, right? 40% of Americans think atheism is very unpatriotic. Not just unpatriotic, but very unpatriotic, right? And up to 1/2 of people have told pollsters that atheism and morality do not mix, right? You can't be atheist and a moral person. One atheist describes how people have sort of physically taken a step backwards when they find out she's an atheist. And another one relates to how she's been asked, well, what stops you from going out and killing people if you don't have religion? And this prejudice can have devastating consequences to atheists in both their public and private lives. So some examples of hostility that's followed an atheist coming out of the closet include a town trustee who had served intermittently for 20 years was recalled from office when people found out he was an atheist. A high school student who was threatened and harassed by her classmates to such a degree that her parents decided to take her out of school and homeschool her instead. And a man whose wife separated from him when he announced his atheism, not so much because she was that she found his beliefs so abhorrent, but she was worried that her inheritance from her religious family would be threatened, right? But the bottom line is there's quite a lot of hostility and prejudice. And in this context, where the hostility and stereotyping of atheists is so common, government religious speech can harm both the equality and liberty of non-believers. And in making this claim, I do understand the Establishment Clause as having an equality component and a religious liberty component. And again, I'd like to repeat that one of the main goals of the Establishment Clause is to protect religious minorities like non-believers. So as for the equality component, my argument is that government religious speech unconstitutionally causes both expressive harms and material harms. So under the expressivist approach to equality, which focuses on social meaning rather than intent or consequences, the government can't convey the message that it values some members of the community more than others because of their religious beliefs. So if, for example, the social meaning of a government monument is that Christians are superior, right, then it violates the equal protection component of the Establishment Clause. And of course, the problem is, as we've been hearing about, it's not always so easy to pinpoint social meaning, right? What if there are competing social meanings? People often disagree about what message is conveyed by government religious speech. So take the recent example of the Latin cross in Salazar versus Bono. Right? Many Christian groups tended to argue that the message of the Latin cross was simply to honor veterans of World War I. Non-Christian groups, on the other hand, argued for a social meaning that involved the government favoring and honoring Christianity. Now, arguably the Christian's view is just a sham, right? But even assuming it's not, and taking it a little more seriously, the Supreme Court tends to opt for the majoritarian view, right? However, the better account is usually the plausible meaning as understood by the minority group, as privileged groups tend to be blind to the way their privilege operates. So the claim that the state cross does not favor Christianity because it's a universal marker of the dead, which was the argument used in Salazar, sort of exemplifies this blindness. Right? A cross may seem like a universal symbol of death to an American Christian because, well, it represents death to them. Right? They may never have learned the symbols that other religious groups do or do not use. And members of dominant groups tend to universalize their subjective experiences. Right? Nonetheless, the Latin cross is a Christian symbol. Right? And indeed, the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs recognizes this because it permits families of veterans to choose one of 39 different emblems of belief for their tombstones. All right, but does being positive about Christianity necessarily equate to a failure to show equal regard for others? Right? Unlike, say, segregation, where the message of superiority and inferiority is unmistakable, the social meaning of support for religion is much less obvious. After all, supporting one thing does not necessarily mean disparaging another. So, for example, right, the state can make because the state makes the piano the official musical instrument of the state, it doesn't convey the message that those who, say, prefer cello are second-class citizens. At the same time, supporting one thing can have these hierarchical connotations. So imagine, for example, that a state declared that the official state race was the white race. And so the question is whether making Christianity the favorite state religion is more like picking a favorite musical instrument or more like picking a favorite race. Right? And I would argue, not surprisingly, it's more like picking a favorite race for a couple of reasons. First, social meaning is dependent on context, and therefore the social meaning of a pro-religion statement has to take into account the prejudice and discrimination that non-believers have in the past and still today face. And second, religion is highly constitutive of identity, so that a state proclaiming this religion is favored is the equivalent to saying people of this religion are favored. And that's exactly the type of message that conflicts with the requirement to show equal regard to everyone, regardless of what their religious beliefs are. Now, in addition to the expressive harms, government religious speech also causes material harms to non-believers. In particular, government religious speech reinforces the stereotypes about atheists that drive so much of the discrimination against them. Government speech both reflects and helps shapes norms and values. And the government, with its religious speech, instead of trying to refute these harmful stereotypes, is actually perpetuating them. So take, for example, the stereotype of atheists as unpatriotic and un-American. Right? Two of the most widespread expressions of American patriotism, our national motto and our national pledge, invoke God. Right? And both were adopted during the Cold War, when the United States, as we heard earlier, when the United States was trying to contrast its godly believing citizens with the godless enemy atheist comrades of the USSR. Right? But adding God in this way to our statements of patriotism sort of reinforces that equation between godly equals patriotic citizen and atheist equals enemy of the US, or at the very least, not such a loyal American citizen. Right? So in this way, the government perpetuates a stereotype that results in discrimination, that deprives atheists of equality in politics, employment, education, custody decisions, and makes them outcasts in their own families, communities, and country. But wait, there's more, right? Government religious speech can also undermine the religious liberty of non-believers in two ways. One, it can coerce them into participating in a religious practice, right? And two, by perpetuating the negative stereotypes about atheists, it helps create a climate in which atheists don't feel free to follow the dictates of their conscience. All right, so the claim that the state religious speech unconstitutionally coerces non-believers into acting contrary to the religious conscience depends on the type of coercion the Establishment Clause is deemed to prohibit. And requiring participation in a prayer on pain of fine or imprisonment obviously amounts to coercion. But that's not the only way the state can wield its power. Right? The state can also coerce by mobilizing social and peer pressure. So imagine that a town council opens its sessions with a prayer, and you're either a member of the town council or a citizen come to speak at the meeting. If you're a non-believer, you have a choice. You can either join the prayer and act contrary to your belief system, or you can refuse to join, out yourself as a non-believer, and suffer the consequences. And remember, the consequences can be severe, right? You can risk your ability to raise your children, earn a living, participate in democracy. As one atheist remarked, if I want a job in the community, I won't say I'm an atheist. Or another, it's the A word. You commit social suicide as a black person if you say you're an atheist. So to argue that non-believers feel no real pressure in these circumstances is really to deny the reality of being atheist in America. All right, but what about the passive displays, right? Passive displays, or speech unconnected to any ritual or practice. In God We Trust and Our Money doesn't force anyone to do anything, even indirectly. But I would argue that even this type of government religious speech can cause harm to religious liberty. Because by reinforcing the negative stereotypes about atheists, it helps create a climate in which atheists do not feel comfortable about following the dictates of their conscience. And as a result, many choose to stay in the closet and pass as believers. And the personal cost of pretending to be something you're not and acting contrary to your beliefs can be very high. Right? At the very least, it requires taking on the identity of a liar. And atheists do regularly report feeling dishonest about keeping their beliefs a secret. Thus, the argument that government religious speech is essentially harmless, or at worst just offensive to non-believers, overlooks the real harms to equality and liberty. And in closing, I want to touch on the state's lack of any real interest in government religious speech. So both secular and religious justifications have been offered. So secular justifications include reasons like the national motto is meant to unite us as a country, or the Latin Cross Memorial is meant to commemorate the sacrifice of World War I veterans, and these are both worthy and important goals. Yet both can be achieved by wholly secular means, and in fact, wholly secular means would more successfully accomplish these goals. For example, a more inclusive symbol would better honor all World War I veterans, Christian believers, non-Christian believers, and non-believers alike. Right? I mean, one of the most moving war memorials we have in this country is the Vietnam War Memorial, which has no religious imagery. Another justification focuses more on the harm to religious believers, some of whom argue that dismantling the war memorial or striking God for our motto actually shows hostility to religion, which is directly counter to the goals of the religion clauses. But there are several reasons to reject this claim. First, it conflates Christianity with the religion. Replacing a Latin cross with a secular symbol doesn't show hostility to Buddhists or Hindus or Wiccans or Sikhs. Right? And second, a secular government is not the equivalent of an anti-religious government. On the contrary, the driving motive in having the government refrain from speaking religiously is to treat all religious beliefs equally and to ensure that all can flourish. Finally, government silence does not affect the equality or liberty of Christians in the way that current government religious speech affects the equality and liberty of non-believers. So government silence on religious doesn't perpetuate any negative stereotypes about Christians in the same way that government religious speech perpetuates negative stereotypes about non-believers. And it's true that while removing government religious symbol may work a change in the status of Christian believers, it's from privileged citizens to equal citizens, not equal citizens to second-class citizens. Furthermore, government silence on religion doesn't create an atmosphere where Christians are hesitant or even afraid to go to church or otherwise practice their faith, in contrast to the way that government religious speech contributes to the atmosphere of hostility that makes atheists want to pass as believers instead of living an authentic life. So given the very weak justifications for government religious speech and the genuine harms to the equality and liberty caused by the government speaking religiously, the Establishment Clause should be understood to bar government religious speech. Such a rule would best help the Establishment Clause accomplish its goal of protecting religious minorities like non-believers.
Well, thank you for that wonderful panel, and I'm actually going to take my, my position on the bully pulpit and take the opportunity to ask the first question here, and then I'll open it up. But I think, like all three of the panelists, I am also a fan of the endorsement test, at least in principle. And I guess this is kind of a question for everyone, because I appreciate the sort of effort that seems to unite these presentations to maybe take Professor Schauer's challenge and try to come up with some rules to make sense of this area. But I wonder whether there are limits to what rules can do here. And I tend to myself, although I believe in the project, I also have a real degree of pessimism about it, because I wonder whether the sort of fights over meaning here are so profound that even attempts to require the government to say, negate explicitly religious language, or to place disclaimers, or to say, well, to have a hard and fast rule against sort of Christian superiority type messages or anti-atheist messages, whether those are sort of doomed to failure, because no one can seem to agree about what any of these things really mean, and that once the government puts a disclaimer up or some other attempt to negate a message, whether there isn't going to be all kinds of new questions that can be raised about that in terms of was it big enough, was it sincere, is it kind of a sham, is it is it a pro-Christian or anti-atheist thing that's going on here? So I'll just throw it out to all of you.
Well, I don't think Mary Jean and I are so far apart. We're both trying to figure out a way to take the government out of the religious message. I think, her way is probably more politically realistic. I think more difficult to implement because it puts the government in a posture of saying, here are the Ten Commandments, but we may not really believe them, right? I mean, the negation and the religious message are both explicit. And that'd be better than what we got. But what I was suggesting was looking more to the religious message has to be embedded in something larger, and the larger has to be genuinely secular and reasonable and not just thrown together. Well, that raises a whole, well, first of all, it's much harder to do because the people who want these things don't want that. Right? They don't want an objective secular message, they want a religious message. But second, then we get into the kinds of things we had in McCreary County where the larger secular context is pretty obviously a sham and doesn't make any sense, and they say things like the Ten Commandments dominated they didn't say dominate. This recognizes the vast importance of the Ten Commandments in the development of American law, which is especially evident in the Declaration of Independence, and no one could find it, right? I mean, one is laws based on the consent of the governed, and the other is laws handed down from God on Mount Sinai. I mean, it's hard to find the parallels there. So, all of these things are politically difficult, and certainly Professor Corbin's vision isn't going to be achievable. There will always be a de minimis exception, right? They will not take "In God We Trust" off the coins, at least not in the lifetime of anyone in this room. They will not tell the president what he can say at an inaugural address or in a Thanksgiving proclamation, and they will not tell Santa Fe and Corpus Christi they have to change the names of the city. There are things the court just ain't going to do, even if she and I could appoint the next 9 justices. So it's hard, but where and maybe the court should have just, and Breyer starts in this direction. Maybe it should have just said, there's statute of limitations. It doesn't matter when you were born. If the thing has been there longer than X, it's grandfathered in. Some of us might not like that result, but it would not put them in the posture of saying a cross is not a Christian symbol.
I think maybe in some ways, I think precisely because of your arguments that so much of this is a sham, is it's not always so hard to determine the social meaning of things. I mean, I don't think that, that there really is any other reading of the cross for Establishment Clause purposes than that it's closely tied to one religion. And so I don't think it's quite as hard. I'm also maybe not quite as pessimistic about a view about how views may change. I certainly don't think this is going to happen immediately, but just thinking about how the nation's views about gays and lesbian rights have undergone a sea change really in the past couple of decades, I'd like to think that may be true for other groups as well.
And I think I'm probably more in line with Doug as far as assessment of what will happen with particular parts of government religious speech. I think that typically throughout all the case law, there's been big distinction between different categories of such speech, and I think that actually works because it is everywhere and it does different amounts of harm depending on where it is. And I guess I loved Caroline, I loved hearing the stories of the atheists and what their experience was, but then I also thought, the kind of impact that you're discussing seems to me created more by kind of the local culture that we would not be able to change even if we took off the "In God We Trust" from the, wherever it is, the money. So I think, I think that's undoable. I think that getting rid of all those particularly small ceremonial deism type of God talk isn't that doable, and I don't know that there's that much of a connection to that and this everyday, the kind of, because I think of like being in a large city and living in a lot of the worlds that most of us maybe live in. And being an atheist would not make you excluded from your work and your home and your family, potentially. Maybe, I don't know, you're in the South, it's a little different. So anyway, but I wanted to follow up first on this endorsement test, and I do think that there's something to be said about trying to find some middle ground, whatever it is. And I think that sometimes it's a sham. It may be a sham, because there's always going to be people who are doing these things for the very reason that they want to promote religion. We've talked about a couple stories, background stories about people not really changing their ways, but at the same time, to the extent that you can come up with rules that people have to obey that are simple, like putting the source of law, putting the Ten Commandments in this elaborate source of law display, which was done just so that they could win a lawsuit, it's still maybe better. It's still maybe in advance to have it that way than not. Or it's still maybe better to have a disclaimer that explains the history of why this cross is up here and what it meant back in World War I when it was put up there, than not to have it. And so because I don't think we're going to get everything turned away, I think keeping some kind of focus on the viewer and the social media today and explaining the secular reasons, sham if they may be, is something. It's a starting point.
Oh, can you wait for the...
Jesse, can you get my pen?
I wanted to ask your thoughts about the limitations on the selective acceptance concept in summum. In particular, they talked about this in the context of permanent physical monuments.
Right.
And do you think that having a forum which is physically foreclosed by such things as a permanent physical monument will act as some kind of limit on the idea of selective acceptance? And if it doesn't this just become viewpoint discrimination? I think in the contrast, for example, to all of those wonderful license plate cases where we now have, we believe, that forum is obviously not foreclosed. You can always do more license plates. Will that be a tenable basis upon which to distinguish some of these cases?
Well, it might be. I don't think, when you have a live speaker who's a private citizen, I don't think the court is likely to say, well, the government can say, we're going to let Jessie speak because we endorse her message and it's really government speech, but we won't let those crazy people on the panel speak because we don't endorse what they say. Anything could happen, but I don't think they're going there. But there are other contexts where this is being litigated where the forum is not necessarily so limited. So these cases about prayer at city council meetings and in the legislature, where Marsh v. Chambers says it's okay to have a prayer there, and then some legislators have a chaplain, but a lot of city councils in particular rotate through the clergy of the community, right? And then, but the imam never gets invited, or actually there's a county in South Carolina having these cases where the Muslim imam was invited, but the Wiccan was excluded. And there, you clearly can expand the rotation. So it's not the same kind of physical limitation you have with permanent monuments, but there is a deep intuition that we don't have to let in religions that are really bad religions in the view of the people of this community, and I don't have any confidence about how those cases are going to come out. The Seventh Circuit had one that mooted out. The county that wouldn't allow the Wiccan won, and the Fourth Circuit and the Supreme Court has so far stayed out of it.
I don't think that the permanent monument part played as big a role as you might think, because essentially they could have simply taken care of all the permanency issues and just said we only have room for 50 monuments in this park, and then done it on some kind of neutral way, a lottery, first in time, that sort of thing. I think all the part in that decision about forums and numbers didn't really make any sense because they really wanted to be able to have particularly viewpoint discrimination. And I don't think we've come to that case yet where they didn't address the case of the Ten Commandments. That was not what was the issue. And so all we do know is that you can take, aside from religion, you can pick one viewpoint and not the other for a government speech. But the permanency is not a factor.
The green sweater.
I would like to ask Professor Corbin a question. I know you did a lot of research into all this. What's the percentage of atheists who feel like they're second-class citizens? Or is this just in one section of the country? It's because that's the first time I've ever heard that.
The one study that I have found that there's not been a lot of research about atheists. It's sort of a new phenomenon. It's popular, but it's not been subject to that much scrutiny. One study I did find showed that at least 80% of atheists that answered the survey said at the very least they felt uncomfortable at family gatherings when a prayer was said, and they felt uncomfortable at the very least. And I don't know if how they broke it down further than that. 80% said felt uncomfortable when there was some kind of public prayer or invocation to God. So the majority of atheists don't like the practices, and
I don't understand that, really, because people are of all different religions, races, and whatever, and they know most people will just say, we believe in a supreme power if you use the word God, or if you don't use the
well, no, actually, that's the disagreement. Atheists don't.
No, we know they don't. Every case I ever read and everything, and it's probably just through the news or the newspapers, anytime I read anything, it was always some father or some mother who said, they say prayer in school when they did, now they don't. Or if you had to do the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag of the United States, they didn't want their children to participate. Well, that's fine. They can sit down. I mean, we go to different people's homes. Maybe they are a different religion. Whoever says the grace save, just as another example, we sit there and they're just beautiful words. And if a person doesn't like it, that's the way it, be that way. But I only see them as individuals who come out and speak as a whole, people who want to grind an axe. I hate to say it. They want some kind of center on themselves, and they use their children. It's basically what you usually hear is the children, because at least I know in a big city like Cleveland, I don't know anybody who's ever said anything about anyone who's an atheist. We won't hire them, we won't talk to them, we won't see them. We just accept them as any other person.
Well, my guess is that there are a lot of atheists who don't say they're atheists precisely because they fear the reaction when they do reveal themselves. So there are a lot of atheists that are just in the closet precisely because they worry about the reaction that would greet them. So people often say, I don't know any atheists. And it's like, well, you actually may know plenty of atheists, they're just not speaking out. And the second point I'd like to say is that, again, the point of the Establishment Clause is that the government should not be taking sides on religion. It should not be endorsing some religious truth over others. And whether or not people are offended by the government doing that or not, there are very good reasons for the government not doing it, one of which I just described is how it really affects the equality and liberty of people who don't conform to that majoritarian religious
view. I think they
view.
have a low self-esteem because they came out and spoke about it.
Okay, we have another question over here. I think we should.
She proves my point.
I have a more sort of fundamental and basic question, and I apologize ahead of time if it sounds tremendously naive. But it seems like there's a lot of haranguing about whether the depiction or image or entity is religious in nature and what it conveys, and not so much analysis and discussion about whether or not it's government speech. And what I mean by that is I think that there's something qualitatively different about walking into a capital of a state and seeing the Ten Commandments and driving by a cross that you see on land that you may or may not know. I mean, I wouldn't know for sure whether that is government land. I mean, I have to go to the recorder's office or something. And I was curious whether or not the courts engage in any analysis with respect to whether something is actually government speech, or whether there's sort of some strict liability. If it's on government land, it's government speech, end of question, or whether there's some sort of analysis of whether or not something like a cross on land far away would be interpreted as governmental upon the person looking at it. Because otherwise I feel like this is an intractable issue. I don't know.
There are a lot of cases on that issue, because once the rule became clearly established that government speech endorsing religion is restricted and private speech is protected, then the game for litigators became to characterize everything on the government or the private side of the line, depending on whether they wanted to suppress it or support it. So there are a lot of cases, and it's just a different issue that we weren't talking much about today. In the particular context of land, certainly you can have private speech on government land. That's what all the public forum cases are about. Summum was about a claim that you can have a public forum for permanent monuments. It doesn't have to be a temporary speaker who comes for a while and then leaves. The Cross in the Desert was in a designated national preserve. It was a unit of the National Park Service. Everybody was there, was coming to visit the park. They're what called inholdings. They're privately owned parcels inside national parks and preserves, and there were some in the area, but the great bulk of the land around was owned by the government, and everybody there would know that because it was a formally designated, national preserve, part of the national park system. But yeah, those issues do get real attention, and they are not always easy.
And I want to add just a point or two to that, which is that's an interesting part about comparing this new government speech defense that these cases are about, where there's really a binary answer. It's either government or private, whereas in the Establishment Clause question, it can be government or private in a way that looks like the government is endorsing it. There's a third option. So that's a lot of the case law. And courts do look very carefully at, they don't always come up with the right answers, but it's always part of the analysis, whether it's by the seat of government or whether it's in a desert. I think there's something in the Bono case and Alito's concurrence about in a place that only a rattlesnake, would see it. So that made a difference, whether it was in the National Mall or in this desert location. And it was interesting delving into this case. When you first hear about this case, it's so outrageous. It seems so clear-cut that it's unconstitutional and should be yanked out immediately. There's a great quote. I think the plaintiffs talk about it being a donut hole in the midst of this 16 million acre national preserve. And so I was kind of interested to find out, one, it's actually more like Swiss cheese. There's a few ranches right around there. Two, Frank Bono, who worked at the preserve, had to, he didn't know. When he first saw that cross, he had to go look up the land records to see if that particular spot was private or public. He didn't know before he brought that lawsuit. So, but these appearances and what facts you're basing your conclusions of whether it's unconstitutional or not, it's all very tricky, but they do take it into account.
And the issue in a lot of these Establishment Clause cases is it's a private speaker, but that speaker has been given preferential access by the government. So if you want to talk about religion, you get to use the microphone, or you get to use the public lands, and you got a different message you don't.
This question is for Professor Corbin, although I think Professor Dolan, in response to Professor Hill's question, may have hinted at it. It seems to me that your proposition is based on the assumption that discrimination against atheists is worse, or will be worse, because the government recognizes religion in some way. So, to me, if the cause of the discrimination is the public's belief, then why does it matter whether or not, why are atheists discriminated against more so because the dollar says, "In God we trust"? Do you have causal evidence? Can you comment on that?
Okay, so I think the question was, well, we're not going to eliminate discrimination against atheists by removing "In God we trust" for the money, so why bother? And my argument is, it's true, I'm not arguing that that is the only source of prejudice and discrimination, but it is one source, and given that the government isn't supposed to be favoring some religions over others, it's at least one source we should end, right? So, for example, if you're thinking about there are 10 companies and they're all dumping toxins in the river, right, and the 10th company's only dumping 10% of the toxin in the river, does that mean, if we're trying to end the pollution, that we should let them off the hook because they're only contributing a small percentage as opposed to all of it? I think the answer is no.
And I want to add also that some of the types of religious government speech that's been called government speech is very damaging to atheists, such as the legislative prayers and the ones where they're more actively involved. Do you think, I'm kind of curious if you would want to, if you draw any distinctions between the levels of harm caused by different kinds of speech?
No.
No. How about your bright line rule?
That's for you.
Woman knows your mind.
Okay.
Justice Kennedy most notably does. The active ceremony he thinks is unconstitutional, the passive display he thinks is fine.
I think it's easier to argue about why that should be stopped, but I think if it causes harm, and I don't think there are strong reasons to continue it, then I think it should cease.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Okay,
Dan?
and this is also for Professor Corbin. Because I find the atheism issue really fascinating. I'm wondering if you think that, does it totally gut the equality rationale? Or is there still room for equality in the Establishment Clause jurisprudence? In other words, if you were to open a legislative session and it's turn for the time for the atheists to come, do we say, and today we'll have no prayer to honor our atheists, or do we invite an atheist to give a statement?
Okay, so my first reaction is the analogy where we're trying to some way to honor everyone, all believers of all kinds. Is there any way to ever do that? And maybe with, given a particular context, maybe a moment of silence, right? Where everyone has a moment to do whatever it is they want to do. And you're not, I think the problem with trying to sort of rotate it among all the religions is I think inevitably it's not going to, there's still going to be some that are going to be much more favored more regularly than others. So I don't think that's quite an answer to that. So you have 100 legislative sessions, and 90% of them are Christian, 10% of them are minority religions, and 1% are atheists. I don't think that's a satisfactory response to trying to really show equal regard for everyone.
Great. Well, thank you. Join me in thanking my